"You are a threat to my focus," the Ice Queen whispered. She pushed a thick envelope across her cold metal desk. Inside was a contract for a kitchen in Paris and a one-way plane ticket. She was the most ruthless executive chef in the city, ruling her Michelin-starred empire with absolute terror. But right now, she was just a woman terrified of losing control, using her power to exile the only person who had ever broken her rules and tasted her surrender. I threw the ticket onto the floor between us. "I am not one of your burnt sauces, Sloane. You cannot just throw me out and start over. If you want me out of your life, you are going to have to look me in the eye and fire me yourself." I stood on the pavement outside Vesper for 2 full minutes before grabbing the heavy brass handle. It was Tuesday at noon. Exactly 59 hours had passed since the empty kitchen, the shattered ice, and the kiss that completely rewired my central nervous system. I had not received a single text message or phone call from her since Sunday morning. A small, paranoid part of my brain wondered if she had panicked in the light of day. I wondered if she had simply booked that flight to Paris herself just to escape the fallout. I took a deep breath of the thick, humid city air and pushed the heavy door open. The prep kitchen was already deafeningly loud. It vibrated with the mechanical roar of commercial food processors and the sharp clattering of steel pans. I walked straight past the dry storage and stopped at the assignment board hanging right outside the employee locker room. My name was written in bold, aggressive, black dry erase marker. It was placed firmly under the meat station, located directly next to the executive chef's central pass. She had actually kept her word. I let out a slow, shaking breath. I tied my heavy canvas apron tight around my waist and walked out onto the main line. Marcus was in the middle of breaking down a massive 80-pound halibut at the fish station. He stopped mid-cut, holding his long fillet knife in the air, and stared directly at me as I began setting up my cutting board. "You are seriously back on meat?" Marcus asked. His voice carried a bizarre mixture of absolute confusion and deep, reluctant respect. "Seems like it," I answered, keeping my tone entirely flat and neutral. "I thought she was going to fire you on Saturday night," he muttered, shaking his head slowly. "Or literally murder you. It was a total coin toss." "I guess I got extremely lucky," I replied quietly. I pulled my heavy whetstone from my leather knife roll. The rest of the kitchen brigade cast nervous, sideways glances in my direction. Every single cook on the line knew that I had openly and repeatedly defied the executive chef. Nobody understood how I was still standing upright in this building, let alone getting promoted back to the most punishing station on the line. At exactly 1 o'clock, the heavy frosted glass doors to the back office swung violently open. The ambient chatter and background noise in the kitchen died an instant, absolute death. Sloane Vance walked out onto the main line. She was wearing a brand new, blindingly white chef's coat that looked completely impenetrable. Her dark hair was pulled so tightly into its signature knot that it caught the fluorescent lights like black glass. She moved down the center aisle with the exact same predatory, terrifying grace she had possessed on my very first day. I watched her entirely from the corner of my eye as I methodically sharpened my flexible boning knife. She did not look in my direction. She stopped squarely behind the central pass and placed her heavy metal clipboard down with a sharp, authoritative click. "Listen up," Sloane announced to the room. Her voice was pure, unadulterated winter ice. Every single head on the line instantly snapped to rigid attention. "The summer tasting menu transitions completely in exactly 3 days," she said smoothly, projecting her voice effortlessly. "Our margins for error are absolute zero." Her pale gray eyes swept methodically over the terrified crew. "I expect total precision today. If your prep work is not absolutely flawless, you will throw it in the trash and start over on your own personal time." She finally turned her head slowly. She looked directly at the meat station, her gaze locked onto mine with the force of a physical blow. There was zero warmth in her expression. There was no secret, lingering smile from Sunday night. It was a look of pure, terrifying professional expectation. "Harper," she said. My name sounded exactly like a whip cracking in the dead quiet room. "Yes, chef," I answered loudly, straightening my spine. "You are entirely responsible for the dry-aged duck crowns today," Sloane instructed coldly. "I need 30 perfectly trimmed portions resting in the cooler by 4 o'clock. She leaned slightly forward over the stainless steel pass. "Not 29 portions, Harper. Exactly 30. "Understood perfectly, chef," I replied, refusing to look away. She held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than was professionally necessary. To the rest of the frightened kitchen, it looked like a brutal, uncompromising warning, but I stood close enough to see the microscopic tightening of her jawline. I saw the tiny, deliberate flare of her nostrils as she breathed in. She was wearing her heavy armor, but she was entirely, acutely aware of exactly what was breathing underneath it. She turned sharply on her heel and walked purposefully toward the large walk-in refrigerator. "Get to work," she commanded aggressively over her shoulder. The kitchen instantly exploded back into frantic, panicked motion. I walked into the walk-in cooler and pulled the first massive rack of dry-aged duck from the metal rolling cart. The aged meat was a deep, dark ruby red. It was covered in a thick, protective layer of dense yellow fat that smelled faintly of earth and thyme. It required absolute, unbroken concentration to separate the delicate breasts from the hard bone cage without tearing the fragile skin. I completely fell into the hypnotic rhythm of the sharp blade. 2 solid hours vanished in a silent, violent blur of blood, bone, and intense physical focus. My cutting board was eventually spotless again, save for the neat, identical rows of perfectly trimmed duck crowns resting on a chilled metal tray. I was busy rendering the leftover scraps of duck fat in a large, heavy-bottomed pot when the air shifted behind me. I smelled bergamot entirely before I heard her footsteps. Sloane was standing directly behind my right shoulder. "Your heat is far too low for a proper, efficient render," she murmured softly. Her voice was pitched perfectly. It was meant absolutely only for my ears, smooth and dangerously quiet under the roar of the exhaust fans. "I am taking it incredibly slow, chef," I answered, deliberately not looking up from the bubbling stove. "I want the liquid fat perfectly clear, 0 scorched proteins." She took a deliberate half-step forward. I could actually feel the intense cold radiating off her pristine coat, pressing lightly against the sweating heat of my back. "You are wasting valuable prep time," she noted calmly. "I am ensuring absolute perfection," I shot back softly, deliberately quoting her own strict culinary philosophy back to her. I heard her let out a very soft, almost completely inaudible exhale through her nose. She reached her arm directly past me to inspect the chilled tray of trimmed duck crowns. Her forearm brushed deliberately against my bicep. It was a fleeting, electric, and completely intentional touch. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I forced my hands to stay perfectly steady on the wooden stirring spoon. She picked up a pair of heavy metal tongs and lifted one of the raw duck breasts into the harsh overhead light. She inspected the tight scoring on the squattin with absolute, microscopic scrutiny. "The cross-hatching on this particular piece is completely uneven," Sloane stated loudly. Her voice was pitched up just enough for Marcus to hear from the fish station. I looked closely at the piece of meat she was holding up. The knife cuts were completely flawless. "Is it really, chef?" I asked evenly, maintaining the charade. "The cuts on the far left side are exactly a millimeter too deep," she lied flawlessly, her face completely deadpan. "The skin will inevitably curl when it hits the hot pan." She dropped the duck breast back onto the metal tray with a loud clatter. "Fix it immediately," she ordered. She turned her body fully toward me. She was standing entirely inside my personal space, completely hidden from the rest of the line by the angle of the tall refrigerators. Her pale gray eyes met mine directly. The heavy ice was completely gone from her gaze, immediately replaced by a dark, suffocating heat. "Do not disappoint me on your first day back, Harper," she whispered fiercely. The heavy words carried a massive double meaning that hit me straight in the center of my chest. "I won't ever let you down, Sloane," I murmured back, completely dropping her formal title. Her breath hitched visibly at the sudden, illicit sound of her first name. She quickly looked away, violently resetting her cold professional mask before anyone else on the line could notice the dangerous slip. "Have this entire station spotless in 20 minutes, Sloane announced briskly to the open room. She walked around rapidly, her heavy black boots clicking sharply against the wet tile floor. I stood alone at the stove and smiled quietly down at the simmering pot of liquid duck fat. The entire game had completely changed overnight. We were no longer fighting each other for control, we were now fighting the entire rest of the world to keep our secret alive. 40-odd hours remained until the official launch of the summer tasting menu. The air inside the Vesper kitchen was so thick with anxiety, you could practically carve it with a dull knife. Sloane was no longer just a demanding executive chef. She had completely morphed into a relentless, terrifying force of nature. She stood at the central stainless steel pass like a general surveying a failing battlefield. Every single dish that approached her station was subjected to an utterly brutal, microscopic interrogation. "The emulsion is broken, Jason," Sloane stated flatly, staring down at a small porcelain bowl of saffron beurre blanc. Jason, the junior saucier, looked like he was about to physically be sick on the tile floor. "I tempered the butter slowly, chef," Jason stammered defensively, his hands shaking. "I swear I kept the heat low." "Swearing does not fix separated fat," Sloane snapped. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. She picked up the bowl and dumped the expensive, ruined sauce unceremoniously into the nearest trash can. "You have exactly 12 minutes to remake it perfectly, or you can take your knives and walk out that door." Jason scrambled back to his station in a blind panic, nearly colliding with a prep cook carrying a massive tray of sea urchins. I watched the entire brutal exchange from my position at the meat station. I was currently basting a rack of lamb in foaming brown butter and crushed garlic. I kept my movements fluid and mechanical, completely refusing to let the surrounding chaos break my absolute focus. Sloane's eyes flicked over to me for a fraction of a second. I saw the deep, dark circles bruising the delicate skin under her eyes. I saw the rigid, painful tension locking her jaw into place. She was pushing the entire brigade to the absolute brink of total collapse. More importantly, she was violently pushing herself far past her own physical limits. "Harper, I need 2 more pints of heavy cream for the potato puree," Marcus called out, breaking my intense concentration. "Heard," I replied loudly, pulling my pan off the direct heat to let the lamb rest. I wiped my hands quickly on a clean towel and walked purposefully toward the back of the kitchen. I pulled the heavy metal handle of the walk-in refrigerator and stepped inside. The heavy door slammed shut behind me with a loud, definitive thud, completely cutting off the roar of the exhaust fans. The temperature inside the walk-in was set to a bone-chilling 34 degrees. The air was dense and smelled intensely of raw earth, fresh herbs, and chilled metal. I walked down the narrow center aisle, scanning the neatly organized wire racks for the dairy bins. I grabbed 2 large plastic cartons of heavy cream. Before I could turn around to leave, the heavy door of the walk-in violently clicked open and shut again. The motion sensor overhead light flickered slightly. Sloane was standing right inside the heavy metal door. She leaned her back fully against the frosted steel panels. Her eyes were squeezed tightly shut. Her breathing was rapid, shallow, and visibly uneven in the freezing air. She looked completely exhausted. She looked entirely like a woman actively drowning in her own unreachable standards. I set the 2 heavy cartons of cream down quietly on a nearby prep table. I did not announce my presence. I simply walked slowly down the narrow aisle until I was standing right in front of her. She opened her eyes instantly when she felt my body heat cutting through the freezing air. "You are going to break Jason entirely if you keep pushing him like that," I said quietly. My voice was a low, steady murmur in the echoing metallic room. Sloane's pale gray eyes flashed with a sudden defensive anger. "He needs to be broken so he can actually learn how to build a proper emulsion," she countered fiercely. "He is terrified of you, Sloane." I pushed back gently, refusing to retreat an inch. "Fear makes people rush. Rushing breaks the sauce." "I cannot accept anything less than absolute perfection," she whispered. Her voice cracked painfully on the final word. She reached up and rubbed her temples aggressively with her freezing fingertips. "The critics are coming back on Friday. If this new menu fails, the entire restaurant falls apart." She was finally speaking her deepest, most guarded fear out loud. The Oust Queen was terrified of losing the empire she had violently bled to build. I took a deliberate step forward. I completely invaded her personal space, trapping her between my body and the heavy metal door. The temperature in the room was freezing, but the air immediate between us held like a scorching open flame. "The menu is brilliant," I told her firmly, staring directly into her panicked eyes. "The concept is flawless." "Concepts do not win Michelin stars, Harper," she argued weakly. "Execution does." "Then let us execute it," I replied softly. I slowly reached out and placed my warm hands flat against her waist. She gasped softly at the sudden burning contrast of temperature. I slid my hands upwards, slipping them beneath the heavy fabric of her crisp white chef's coat. I pressed my palms directly against the rigid, tense muscles of her lower back. Sloane instantly looped her head forward, resting her forehead heavily against my shoulder. She let out a long, violently shaking exhale. I could actually feel the agonizing tension slowly draining out of her spine under my touch. "You have to trust the brigade," I whispered into the dark hair near her ear. "I only trust you," she confessed, blindly into the fabric of my apron. The absolute vulnerability in her statement hit me like a physical punch to the chest. She wrapped her arms tightly around my waist, pulling me completely flush against her body. We stood perfectly still in the freezing darkness of the walk-in cooler. Every single breath we took plumed into white fog that instantly mingled in the space between us. I tilted my head down. I pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to the sensitive skin just below her jawline. Sloane shuddered violently in my arms. Her fingers dug possessively into the thick canvas of my apron. "We have to go back out there," she whispered breathlessly, her voice thick with sudden, desperate desire. "I know," I murmured against her skin. I reluctantly pulled my hands out from under her coat. I took a half step back, rebuilding the necessary professional distance before we completely lost our minds in a refrigerator. Sloane took a deep, shuddering breath. She forcefully smoothed down the front of her white coat. When she finally looked up at me again, the blind panic was entirely gone from her eyes. The sharp, impenetrable ice had successfully returned, but it was now anchored by something solid. "Bring Jason the cream," Sloane ordered quietly, her voice returning to its normal, steady pitch. "Yes, chef," I answered softly. I grabbed the 2 heavy cartons from the metal table. Sloane opened the heavy door first and stepped back out into the roaring heat of the kitchen. I followed her exactly 10 seconds later. Nobody noticed a single thing. But as I handed the cream to Jason, I looked toward the central pass. Sloane was already standing there, perfectly composed and utterly terrifying once again. But for a single, fleeting second, her pale eyes found mine through the heavy smoke. The private fire was still burning brightly under the ice, completely ready to consume us both. The main dining room of Vesper was bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of Wednesday afternoon. The heavy velvet curtains were pulled entirely back. The usually romantic, dimly lit space felt exactly like a corporate boardroom. It was 2 o'clock. It was time for the official menu rollout. Every single member of the front-of-house staff was seated around the massive center oak table. Bennett, the general manager, sat at the head of the table with a sleek, silver tablet. Next to him sat Chloe, the head sommelier. She had 3 different crystal wine glasses lined up meticulously in front of her. This was the final, brutal gauntlet. If the front-of-house team did not completely understand and believe in the new menu, they could not sell it to the guests. Sloane stood at the front of the dining room. She was presenting the dishes with cold, mechanical efficiency. "Course number 3, Sloane announced to the silent room. "Spot prawn crudo, yuzu gel, and smoked buckwheat." I stood behind the open exposition counter of the kitchen, carefully wiping the rims of the slate-gray plates. Marcus and I carried the plates out to the dining room in total silence. We placed them carefully in front of the management team. Chloe picked up her fork. She tasted the crudo thoughtfully. She took a slow sip from the middle crystal glass, containing a crisp, mineral-heavy chablis. "The smoked buckwheat is a brilliant addition, chef," Chloe noted, typing rapidly on her laptop. "It bridges the gap to the oak and the wine perfectly." Sloane simply nodded. She did not look at me. "Clear the plates," Sloane ordered. "Fire course number 4. I walked back into the kitchen. My heart rate immediately spiked. Course number 4 was the matsutatsu mushroom. It was the dish that had completely shattered the ice between us on Sunday afternoon. I arranged the delicate, pale mushrooms in the center of the shallow, white porcelain bowls. I picked up the heavy cast-iron teapot. It was filled with the deeply aromatic, cedar-smoked dashi broth. Marcus and I carried the bowls out to the tasting table. I poured the steaming, dark golden liquid directly over the raw mushrooms at the table. The aggressive, deeply earthy scent of burning cedar and wet pine immediately rushed upward. It completely overpowered the faint smell of expensive cleaning supplies in the dining room. Chloe immediately frowned. She leaned directly over the bowl, inhaling sharply. She did not look pleased. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulled together in deep skepticism. She puffed up her silver spoon and took a small, hesitant sip of the hot broth. Then, she picked up her first glass of wine. It was a Premier Cru Rate Burgundy. She took a sip of the expensive wine, her face instantly twisted in active distaste. "No," Chloe stated flatly, setting the crystal glass down with a sharp clink. The entire dining room went dead silent. Nobody openly rejected a dish in front of Sloane Vance. Sloane crossed her arms tightly over her white chef's coat. "Explain the problem, Chloe." "It is entirely too aggressive, chef," Chloe said, pushing the porcelain bowl a fraction of an inch away from her. "The smoke completely kills the delicate fruit notes in the burgundy," the sommelier continued defensively. "It makes the wine taste like bitter ash." Bennett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Perhaps we can tone down the smoking process in the kitchen." "It is not a Vesper dish," Chloe added ruthlessly. "It is far too rustic. It lacks our signature refinement." I stood perfectly still behind the exposition counter. My hands gripped the cool stainless steel edge tightly. I waited for the inevitable explosion. I waited for Sloane to brutally tear the sommelier apart for questioning her menu. Sloane stared down at Chloe. The muscles in her jaw worked silently. She uncrossed her arms. She looked up and locked her pale gray eyes directly onto mine across the open dining room. She did not look angry. She looked incredibly calm. "Harper," Sloane said clearly, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "Yes, chef." "Come out here," she commanded softly. I let go of the metal counter. I walked out of the kitchen and stood right beside Sloane at the head of the heavy oak table. I could smell her bergamot cutting through the heavy scent of the cedar smoke. "Chloe believes the dish is entirely too rustic to pair," Sloane stated, looking directly at me. "She believes it kills the wine." Sloane was officially yielding the floor to me. It was a massive, public display of absolute trust. "You are pouring the wrong wine," I said calmly, looking directly down at the head sommelier. Chloe scoffed slightly, her professional pride visibly wounded. "It is a $400 bottle of vintage white burgundy. It pairs with everything. It pairs with butter and safe choices," I countered firmly, keeping my voice completely even. "This broth is built on survival," I explained, gesturing to the steaming bowl. "It is built on fire, damp earth, and the raw forest floor." I looked around the table, ensuring I held the entire room's attention. "You cannot fight the smoke with delicate flowers," I stated. "You will lose every single time." Bennett leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "What do you suggest we pour then, Harper?" "You need earth to meet earth," I said confidently. "You need oxidation and heavy skin contact." I looked back at Chloe. "Pour a Vin Jaune from the Jura region, or a heavily aged skin contact Pinot Gris." Chloe stared at me in absolute shock. "An orange wine? In the main dining room?" "It has the necessary structure," I insisted. "It has the nutty, bruised apple notes that will actually wrap around the cedar smoke instead of fighting it." Chloe looked to Sloane for intervention. She clearly expected the executive chef to shut down this ridiculous, rebellious suggestion. Sloane did not blink. She kept her eyes entirely fixed on Chloe. "Go to the cellar, Chloe," Sloane ordered quietly. "Bring up the 2014 Jacques Puffany Vin Jaune." Chloe practically scrambled out of her chair. She power-walked toward the glass-enclosed wine cellar at the back of the restaurant. She returned 3 minutes later with a dusty bottle. She poured a small amount of the dark golden wine into a fresh glass. She took a sip of the wine. Then she took a sip of the smoked broth. The entire room watched her throat work as she swallowed. Chloe closed her eyes. She slowly lowered the silver spoon back to the table. "Well?" Sloane asked, her voice completely devoid of any specific emotion. "It is spectacular," Chloe admitted in a breathless whisper. "The smoke actually elevates the hidden spice in the wine." She looked up at me with a completely new expression. It was absolute, undeniable respect. "It completely changes the entire palette," Chloe confirmed, typing furiously into her laptop. "It is the best pairing on the new menu." Bennett let out a massive sigh of relief. The rest of the front-of-house staff quietly murmured their strict agreement. "Write it down," Sloane instructed the general manager. "The pairing is officially approved." Sloane turned her head slightly to look at me. We were standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the entire management team. Her pale gray eyes were completely warm. The ice was entirely absent. She was looking at me with a deep, hidden, and fiercely possessive pride. "Get back to your station, Harper," she murmured softly. The command was strictly professional, but the tone was incredibly intimate. "Yes, chef," I replied quietly. I turned and walked back into the roaring heat of the kitchen. We had successfully defended our shared vision. The Michelin Ice Queen was no longer ruling her empire entirely alone. She finally had a partner on the battlefield. Friday night was the official launch. The dining room was completely overbooked by 6 o'clock. Every single local food critic, lifestyle blogger, and industry VIP was sitting in our front room. The ticket machine began its mechanical screaming and simply refused to stop. The noise in the kitchen was absolutely deafening. Sloane was operating at a terrifying, hyper-focused frequency at the pass. She did not yell. Her voice cut through the heavy smoke like a surgical scalpel. "Table 9, firing courses 3 and 4, Sloane commanded sharply. "Yes, chef," the gigate echoed back in unison. I was working the meat station in a blind, rhythmic trance. The heat radiating off the French-taught stove was intense enough to strip the moisture right out of my lungs. We were crushing the service. The timing was absolutely flawless, until exactly 8:30. The primary combi oven at the back of the line suddenly beeped loudly. The digital interface flashed a violent, bright red error code. Marcus dropped his tongs onto his cutting board. He stared at the oven in pure horror. "Chef," Marcus choked out, his voice cracking entirely. "The main oven just died." The ambient noise in the kitchen vanished in a seagull heartbeat. "What do you mean it died?" Sloane asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The circulation fan is completely dead," Marcus panicked, frantically pressing the digital buttons. "The temperature is dropping rapidly." My stomach instantly hit the floor. We had 14 dry-aged duck crowns scheduled for the next immediate seating. They absolutely required precise, circulated ambient heat to finish roasting without burning the delicate skin. Sloane turned her head to look at the dead machine. All the color rapidly drained from her face. She was calculating the catastrophic fallout in real time. 14 ruined main courses meant the entire flow of the dining room would collapse within 10 minutes. It was a fatal, unrecoverable disaster for a Michelin-starred launch night. I did not wait for her to give an order. I turned around and grabbed 3 massive, heavy cast-iron skillets from the lower rack. I threw them directly onto the hottest center rings of the French top stove. "Bring me all the duck crowns right now," I shouted at Jason over the roar of the exhaust hoods. Jason froze like a deer in headlights. "Do it now, Jason," I yelled, tossing massive knobs of butter and handfuls of crushed garlic into the smoking cast iron. Sloane snapped out of her paralyzed calculation. She looked directly at me. "You cannot pan roast that many crowns at once," Sloane warned intensely. "The heat distribution is entirely too volatile." "I can and never stop moving them," I countered fiercely. I grabbed a pair of long steel tongs in each hand. Jason practically threw the metal tray of raw duck onto my station. I dropped the birds into the screaming hot fat. The aggressive hiss of rendering meat filled the tense kitchen. I needed to constantly baste and rotate all 14 crowns simultaneously to mimic the ambient heat of the dead oven. It was an impossible physical task for one person. Then, the air shifted right next to my shoulder. Sloane stepped completely into my station. She did not say a single word. She grabbed a large silver basting spoon and a thick, dry towel. She stood shoulder to shoulder with me, directly in front of the raging fire. We did not communicate verbally. We didn't have to. I flipped the heavy crowns to sear the sides. Sloane immediately followed, basting the exposed meat with the foaming, aromatic butter. Our hands moved in an aggressive, flawless, and violently synchronized dance. We dodged each other's elbows by mere millimeters. The physical heat was completely overwhelming. Sweat poured down my forehead and stung my eyes, but the energy radiating between us was absolutely electric. She anticipated my rotations perfectly. She controlled the fold while I controlled the crust. We were operating as a single, fully integrated nervous system in front of the entire terrified brigade. Exactly 6 minutes later, I pulled the fond duck crowns from the cast iron. I dropped it onto the resting rack with a loud, definitive clatter. Sloane immediately pressed her steel kick taster into the thickest part of the meat. She touched the metal to her lower lip. She closed her eyes and let out a long, heavy exhale. "Perfect medium rare," she announced to the silent kitchen. "Every single one of them." The entire line collectively gasped in relief. Marcus practically sagged against his prep table. Sloane turned her head to look at me. Her face was flushed dark red from the intense heat of the stove. Her crisp white coat was splattered with dark brown butter and meat juices. She looked completely wrecked, and she had never looked more beautiful. "Plate them," she ordered softly. Her eyes locked entirely on mine. We survived the rest of the night on pure, unadulterated adrenaline. By 1 a.m, the kitchen was finally scrubbed clean and silent. The crew clocked out rapidly, desperate to go home and collapse. I pushed through the heavy metal back doors and stepped out into the dark alleyway. The night air was cool and smelled of damp pavement and distant city rain. I leaned the back of my head against the cool brick wall of the restaurant and closed my eyes. Every single muscle in my shoulders and forearms ached violently. The heavy metal door groaned open again. I opened my eyes. Sloane stepped out into the dim yellow light of the alley. She'd taken off her chef's coat entirely. She was wearing a plain, slightly worn gray t-shirt. It was the most casual, unguarded piece of clothing I had ever seen her wear. She walked over and leaned against the brick wall right next to me. Our shoulders brushed lightly. Neither of us pulled away. "The oven repair company is coming at 6 a.m, Sloane murmured into the quiet night. "Good," I replied softly, "because my forearms will actually fall off if we have to do that again tomorrow." A low, genuine laugh escaped her lips. The sound echoed softly in the narrow alley. She turned her head to look at me. The harsh, defensive mask was entirely gone. "You saved my restaurant tonight, Harper." "We saved it," I corrected gently. "You stepped onto the line. You basted the meat." "I followed your lead," she admitted quietly. It was a massive, unprecedented confession for her. She reached her hand out slowly in the dark. Her cold fingers found mine. She intertwined them gently, pressing our palms together. I tightened my grip, anchoring her completely. "I have never followed anyone's lead in my entire life," she whispered, looking down at our joined hands. "It wasn't following," I told her, using my free hand to gently push a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. "It was just trusting." Sloane looked up at me. Her pale eyes were entirely wide and defenseless in the shadows. She stepped away from the brick wall. She moved entirely into my space, pressing her chest flush against mine. She rested her head against my shoulder and wrapped her arms tightly around my waist. We stood completely alone in the dark alley, holding each other in the quiet aftermath of the fire. The Michelin Ice Queen had finally surrendered her absolute control, and she was perfectly safe in my arms. Sunday evenings were traditionally dedicated to sleeping until absolute noon. Not today. My phone buzzed quietly on my nightstand at exactly 8 a.m. It was a single text message containing a high-end residential address and a gate code. I did not hesitate. I threw on a clean white t-shirt, my favorite faded jeans, and a dark leather jacket. The address belonged to a luxury high-rise building in the absolute center of the city's most expensive district. The elevator opened directly into her private penthouse apartment. I stepped out of the heavy steel doors and immediately stopped breathing for a second. The apartment was stunning, but it was completely freezing. It was a sprawling, open-concept space constructed entirely of white marble, polished concrete, and floor-to-ceiling glass. There were no colorful throw pillows, there were no framed photographs or personal mementos anywhere in sight. It looked exactly like a high-end architectural magazine spread. It was absolutely flawless, and it was entirely empty. "I am in the kitchen," Sloane called out softly from the back of the apartment. I walked slowly across the polished concrete floor, my boots echoing slightly in the massive space. Sloane was standing behind a breathtaking, custom-built white marble kitchen island. She was wearing a long, flowing robe made of heavy, dark slate-gray silk. Her dark hair was completely down. It fell in soft, loose waves, cascading entirely over her bare shoulders. I had never seen her hair down before. It completely transformed her sharp, severe facial features into something devastatingly soft. She was operating a massive, commercial-grade chrome espresso machine. "You have a better kitchen here than most restaurants in this city," I noted, looking at the pristine 8-burner gas range. "I bought the appliances for the aesthetic," Sloane admitted quietly, handing me a small wound porcelain cup of dark espresso. "I have practically never turned the actual stove on." I took a sip of the bitter, perfectly extracted coffee. I looked closely at the spotless stainless steel grates on the stove. "You are the executive chef of a 3-Michelin-star restaurant," I said, leaning gently against the cold marble counter. "And you do not cook at home?" "When I am at Vesper, I have to be completely perfect," Sloane explained, looking down at her own coffee cup. "When I come home, I just want the absolute silence. Cooking requires a specific noise I do not want here." It was a deeply lonely admission. This beautiful, expensive fortress was where the Ice Queen came to isolate herself from the entire world. I set my espresso cup down on the marble counter with a soft click. "Do you have any actual food in that massive refrigerator?" I asked, gesturing toward the sleek, built-in silver doors. Sloane looked slightly confused. "There might be some eggs and a block of cultured butter." "Perfect," I said simply. I walked completely around the marble island. I deliberately stepped into her personal space. I reached out and gently untied the silk belt of her dark robe. Sloane's breath hitched instantly. Her pale gray eyes widened in sudden, beautiful surprise. I did not pull the robe off. I simply pulled the front edges together to keep her warm in the freezing apartment. "Sit down," I instructed softly, pointing toward the modern leather bar stools on the other side of the island. "I'm going to make the noise for you today." Sloane did not argue. She walked around the counter and sat down obediently, watching me with absolute, rapt attention. I opened the massive refrigerator. She was not lying. It was practically entirely empty. I found a half-empty carton of organic eggs, a block of expensive French butter, and a small bunch of slightly wilted chives. I turned on the heavy gas range. The blue flame roared to life instantly, shattering the sterile silence of the apartment. I cracked 3 eggs into a glass bowl. I whisked them rapidly with a metal fork until the yolks and whites were completely incorporated. "What exactly are you making?" Sloane asked quietly. Her chin was resting delicately in her hands. "A classic French omelette," I answered, dropping a heavy tablespoon of the cultured butter into a heated nonstick pan. The butter immediately began to foam and sing in the pan. The rich, nutty aroma completely filled the sterile kitchen. "No truffles? No caviar?" Sloane teased softly, a faint, genuine smile playing on her lips. "Just heat, fat, and absolute technique," I countered, pouring the beaten eggs directly into the foaming butter. I shook the pan aggressively back and forth, stirring the eggs rapidly to create incredibly small, delicate curds. It required total focus to ensure the eggs cooked perfectly without taking on a single hint of brown color. Before the top was entirely set, I tapped the handle of the pan sharply. The pale yellow omelet folded over itself flawlessly. I slid the perfect, seamless, pale cylinder onto a plain white plate. I finished it with a tiny smear of cold butter and a dusting of chopped chives. I walked the plate around the island and set it directly in front of her. "Eat," I commanded gently. Sloane picked up a silver fork. She cut into the center of the omelet. The inside was perfectly soft and incredibly creamy. It was the absolute definition of culinary comfort. She took a bite. She closed her eyes entirely, letting out a long, quiet sigh. "It is flawless, Harper," she murmured, opening her eyes to look at me. "It tastes like actual warmth." I leaned against the counter next to her stool. "You spend your entire life feeding the most critical people in the world." I reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Somebody needs to feed you, Sloane." She leaned her face heavily into the palm of my hand. Her skin was warm and incredibly soft. The absolute trust radiating from her was completely overwhelming. "Marcus knows," Sloane stated suddenly, her voice dropping into a serious whisper. The sudden mention of the sous chef completely shattered the quiet domestic bubble we had just built. He didn't say anything, I replied carefully, keeping my hand gently against her cheek. He does not have to say anything, Sloane said, setting her fork down. He watched us completely synchronize on the friend's talk on Friday. She looked directly into my eyes. The heavy weight of her professional reality was crashing back down on her shoulders. You cannot fake that specific kind of rhythm, Harper. He knows exactly what is happening between us. Marcus is loyal to you, I reasoned quietly. He practically worships the ground you walk on. He is loyal to the restaurant, Sloane corrected firmly, and the Michelin Guide drops its new ratings in exactly 3 weeks. I felt a sudden, cold chill run down my spine. If the critics get even a single whisper that the executive chef is sleeping with her line cook, the entire narrative completely changes, she explained. Her voice was entirely calm, but her eyes were filled with a deep, familiar terror. We become a kitchen completely driven by inappropriate favoritism instead of absolute culinary excellence. They will strip our 3rd star in a heartbeat. She was completely right. The fine dining industry was incredibly vicious and unforgiving. So what do we do? I asked, pulling my hand back slightly to give her space. Sloane immediately reached out. She grabbed my wrist tightly, absolutely refusing to let me pull away from her. We do exactly what we have to do to protect the kitchen, she stated fiercely, her pale eyes flashing with sudden iron resolve. We maintain the absolute ice during service. We do not give them a single reason to doubt our professional integrity. She pulled me closer, burying her face into the fabric of my t-shirt. But I am absolutely not letting you go, Harper, she whispered, desperately against my chest. Not for Marcus, not for the Michelin Guide, not for anything. I wrapped both of my arms tightly around her shoulders. I kissed the top of her dark head. We had successfully navigated the roaring fire of the commercial kitchen. Now, we had to survive the absolute freezing scrutiny of the entire culinary world. The transition back to reality on Tuesday afternoon was absolutely brutal. We had agreed to maintain the ice during service, but I entirely underestimated Sloane's capacity for coldness. She did not just rebuild the wall between us. She fortified it with razor wire and shattered glass. The Michelin Guide announcement was looming exactly 21 days away. The pressure inside Vesper was completely crushing. Sloane patrolled the central pass like a starved predator looking for the weakest link. And for the next 4 days, she made absolutely sure that everyone believed the weakest link was me. This sear is pathetic, Harper, Sloane announced loudly during the Thursday dinner rush. She held up a beautiful piece of venison on her long metal tweezers. The crust was perfectly caramelized, but she threw it into the trash anyway. You are relying on residual heat instead of actual technique, she lied seamlessly to the entire kitchen. Fire it again. Do not embarrass my menu. Marcus flinched at the adjacent fish station. The rest of the line cooks completely avoided looking in my direction. Yes, chef, I answered evenly, grabbing a fresh piece of meat. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I just swallowed the public humiliation and kept cooking. It was a dangerous, exhausting psychological game. Every single time she yelled at me, I caught the microscopic tremor in her left hand. Every time she rejected my plates, I saw the dark flash of absolute regret hidden deep in her pale gray eyes. She was punishing me publicly to protect us both, but it was actively destroying her own nerves. By Friday night, the tension on the meat station was absolutely unbearable. We were in the middle of a massive 200-cover service. The ticket printer was essentially spitting out a solid white ribbon of paper. I was plating a delicate squab when a drop of cherry reduction accidentally splashed onto the absolute outer edge of the pristine white plate. It was a minor, easily fixable mistake. I immediately reached for my damp towel to wipe it clean. Sloane slammed her heavy metal clipboard down onto the stainless steel pass. The loud crack silenced the immediate area. "Stop," Sloane commanded. Her voice was terrifyingly calm and utterly venomous. I froze, holding the damp towel suspended in the air. "You are becoming incredibly sloppy, Harper," she stated, making sure Marcus could hear every single word. "You are taking your position on this line for granted." "It was a slip of the spoon, Chef," I replied quietly. "I am fixing it." "You do not fix sloppiness with a towel," she snapped back instantly. "You fix it with discipline." She stepped aggressively into my space, her eyes completely devoid of any recognizable warmth. "When service concludes tonight, you will completely empty and scrub the dry storage room," she ordered. "Every single shelf, every single floor tile." It was a punishing 4-hour cleaning job entirely reserved for disobedient dishwashers. Marcus actually stepped forward, opening his mouth to intervene. Sloane shot him a look that practically froze the blood in his veins. Marcus slowly stepped back, completely intimidated. "Understood, Chef," I said, keeping my face completely blank. I wiped the plate clean and pushed it onto the pass. She inspected it silently and handed it to a food runner. The rest of the service was a violent, silent blur. At midnight, the brigade practically sprinted out the back doors. Nobody wanted to stick around and watch the Ice Queen execute me. By 12:30, the kitchen was completely empty. I walked to the back of the building and opened the heavy door to the dry storage room. It was a massive, windowless space filled with towering wire racks of flour, sugar, and expensive imported spices. I grabbed a bucket of hot soapy water and a stiff scrub brush. I knelt on the hard tile floor and began to aggressively scrub. My muscles ached violently from the long service. My hands were heavily calloused and burned. I scrubbed the floor for exactly 40 minutes in absolute silence. Then, the heavy door clicked shut, plunging the room into the dim, security-level lighting. There were no security cameras in the dry storage room, we both knew that. Sloane walked slowly down the narrow aisle of wire racks. She had taken off her chef's coat. She was wearing black silk camisole and her dark uniform trousers. Her hair was still pulled back, but several dark strands had escaped to frame her exhausted face. I dropped the scrub brush into the soapy water. I stood up slowly, wiping my wet hands on my apron. She stopped exactly 1 foot away from me. The sharp scent of bergamot completely overpowered the smell of bulk spices. We stared at each other in the dim light. The heavy, oppressive ice of the kitchen was completely gone. "I threw away perfectly good venison today," she whispered. Her voice was shaking with suppressed emotion. "I know," I answered quietly. "I humiliated you in front of the entire brigade," she continued, her breathing becoming rapid and uneven. "I treated you like absolute garbage." "You did exactly what we agreed to do," I reassured her, taking a slow step forward. "You protected the kitchen. I hated every single second of it," she confessed fiercely. She reached out and violently grabbed the heavy canvas straps of my apron. She pulled me forward with shocking, desperate strength. She slammed me backward into the heavy wire shelving. A massive bag of flour shifted precariously on the shelf above us, but neither of us cared. Her mouth crashed down onto mine. It was not a gentle kiss. It was an absolute raging inferno of guilt, relief, and suppressed desire. I groaned against her lips. I wrapped my arms tightly around her waist, lifting her slightly off the hard tile floor. She tangled her cold fingers aggressively into my short hair. She kissed me like she was literally dying of thirst. The contrast was absolutely intoxicating. The woman who had ruthlessly berated me an hour ago was now completely falling apart in my arms. We were playing a dangerously high-stakes game of professional survival. The public cruelty only served to make the private surrender infinitely more explosive. She finally broke the kiss, gasping heavily for air. She rested her forehead heavily against my neck. "I am going to completely lose my mind before the Michelin Guide even arrives," she whispered into my skin. I tightened my grip around her waist, anchoring her in the dark, hidden room. "No, you aren't," I promised softly. "We just have to survive the next 21 days." She looked up at me, her pale eyes dark and entirely unguarded in the shadows. "Then scrub faster, Harper," she murmured, a faint, dangerous smirk finally touching her swollen lips. "Because I am not leaving this building without you tonight." I smiled back, completely addicted to the thrilling, terrifying fire hidden perfectly beneath her ice. 10 days remained until the Michelin Guide released its annual ratings. The atmosphere inside Vesper was no longer just tense, it was actively toxic. Everyone was completely sleep-deprived. Everyone was operating on pure, unadulterated fear. It was Thursday night at 8 o'clock. Bennett, the general manager, pushed through the heavy kitchen doors. He bypassed the expediter completely and walked straight to Sloane at the pass. "Table 4, Bennett whispered. His face was entirely devoid of color. Sloane did not look up from the ticket rail. "Specify." "A lone diner. He asked for a specific brand of sparkling water. He is asking incredibly detailed questions about the sourcing of the scallops." Bennett swallowed hard. He dropped a napkin twice to time our replacement speed. The entire kitchen collectively stopped breathing. It was the classic, undeniable profile of an anonymous Michelin inspector. Sloane's spine went completely rigid. Her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped the edge of the stainless steel counter. "He ordered the full tasting menu," Bennett added nervously, "and he requested the roasted squab as a supplement." The squab was my station. Sloane slowly lifted her head. She looked directly across the kitchen at me. There was no hidden affection in her pale gray eyes tonight. There was only absolute, terrifying desperation. This was the exact moment that decided if she kept her 3rd star or lost her entire empire. "Fire the tasting menu for table 4, Sloane announced. Her voice was completely hollow. The brigade snapped into a violent, frantic rhythm. I turned to my station. I pulled a fresh, perfectly prepped squab from the lowboy cooler. My hands were entirely steady. I completely blocked out the roaring noise of the kitchen. I focused entirely on the heavy cast-iron pan and the smoking brown butter. I seared the delicate bird with absolute mechanical precision. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in silent, suffocating panic. Every single plate that left the kitchen was inspected by Sloane for agonizingly long seconds. She was rejecting dishes for microscopic, practically invisible flaws. Marcus was sweating profusely at the fish station. He had already remade the halibut twice. Finally, it was time for the supplementary course. "Squab to the pass," Sloane commanded. Her voice was noticeably tighter. I sliced the resting meat in 2 clean, perfect motions. The center was a flawless, edge-to-edge ruby red. I slid the heated plate onto the center of the pass. Sloane picked up her long metal plating tweezers. She reached for the delicate black truffle shavings. She needed to place exactly 3 shavings perfectly across the curve of the meat. I watched her hand hover over the plate. Her fingers were shaking. It was a tiny, microscopic tremor. Nobody else on the line could possibly see it from their stations, but I was standing exactly 24 inches away from her. The crushing weight of the Michelin inspector was finally breaking her absolute control. If she dropped the truffle incorrectly, she would throw the entire plate away. We would lose our timing. The inspector would wait. She took a sharp, shallow breath. She tried to force her hand to steady. The tremor simply grew worse. I did not think about the consequences. I did not care about the professional boundaries. I stepped completely out of my station. I moved directly up to the central pass. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over hers. Her skin was completely freezing. My palm was scorching hot from the stove. Sloane gasped softly, her pale eyes snapping up to meet mine in sheer panic. "Let go," she breathed, terrified that the brigade would see. "I have it," I murmured softly, keeping my voice buried under the roar of the exhaust fans. I did not take the tweezers from her. I simply guided her shaking hand with my own steady grip. Together, we placed the 3 black truffle shavings perfectly onto the squab. I squeezed her hand once, firmly and reassuringly, before pulling away entirely. I stepped backward into my station. The entire interaction took exactly 3 seconds. Sloane stared down at the perfect plate. She took a deep, steadying breath. Her professional mask slammed violently back into place. "Service!" she called out, clearly. The runner took the plate to the dining room. The crisis was averted. The inspector finished his meal 30 minutes later and left quietly. The kitchen survived the night. At 1 in the morning, the heavy exhaust hoods were finally shut down. I finished scrubbing my cutting board. I grabbed my canvas knife roll and walked down the hallway. I turned the corner toward the locker room. Marcus was standing directly in the center of the narrow corridor. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest. He was not wearing his chef's coat. "We need to talk," Marcus stated. His voice was completely devoid of its usual friendly warmth. I stopped walking. "It is late, Marcus. I'm tired." "I saw what you did at the pass tonight," he said. He did not move out of my way. My heart rate spiked, but I kept my face entirely blank. "I helped the executive chef plate a delayed course," I replied evenly. "It is my job." "Do not insult my intelligence, Harper," Marcus snapped, stepping closer. "I have worked for Sloane Vance for 4 years. She has never let another cook touch her hands during service." He stared at me with absolute cold clarity. "You did not just help her plate. You steadied her. You broke the line." I gripped the handle of my knife roll tightly. I did not say a word. "I know she has been treating you like garbage for the past week," Marcus continued, his voice dropping lower. "And I know exactly why she is doing it. She is overcompensating." He had figured it out. The secret was completely out in the open. "You are going to destroy her," Marcus warned fiercely. "I am protecting her," I argued, my voice finally rising to meet his anger.
"You are a distraction," he countered brutally. "The Michelin guide is literally at our front door." He pointed a finger directly at my chest. "If they find out she is compromising the integrity of this kitchen for a line cook, she loses everything." I stood perfectly still in the dim hallway. The truth of his words felt like a physical weight. "She built this empire from nothing," Marcus whispered. "Do not be the reason it burns to the ground." He turned around and walked out the back door, leaving me completely alone in the silent corridor. I looked down at the tile floor. My chest felt incredibly tight. I was entirely in love with the Ice Queen, but loving her might be the exact thing that ruined her life. Marcus was entirely right. I spent the entire weekend staring at the ceiling of my dark apartment. I was a massive, walking liability to the woman I loved. If the Michelin board discovered our relationship, they would completely invalidate her life's work. They would claim she lost her objectivity. They would strip the 3rd star, and the industry would devour her alive. I could not be the reason the Ice Queen lost her crown. When I walked into Vesper on Tuesday afternoon, I completely locked my heart in a steel box. I rebuilt the physical and emotional wall between us, but I made it 10 times thicker. Sloane noticed the sudden, violent shift immediately. During prep, she walked past my station and deliberately let her shoulder brush against mine. I flinched and stepped back instantly, apologizing with a loud, formal, and completely hollow voice. Sloane stopped dead in her tracks. Her pale gray eyes searched my face for an explanation. I kept my expression entirely blank and turned back to my cutting board. The next 3 days were a masterclass in self-inflicted torture. I spoke to her only when absolutely necessary for the service. I refused to meet her gaze at the pass. I completely ignored the lingering, desperate questions in her eyes. I was starving her out, and it was actively destroying me from the inside. Thursday night finally arrived. It was the absolute eve of the Michelin Guide announcement. The tension in the restaurant was thick enough to choke on. We executed a flawless service, entirely fueled by nervous, frantic adrenaline. At midnight, the kitchen finally began to power down. I grabbed a metal clipboard to take the final inventory of the meat station. I walked to the back of the kitchen and pulled open the heavy door to the walk-in cooler. I stepped inside the freezing room. I started counting the remaining dry-aged ducks. 30 seconds later, the heavy metal door clicked shut. I heard the distinct mechanical sound of the interior deadbolt sliding into place. I turned around slowly. Sloane was standing with her back pressed against the locked metal door. She was breathing heavily. Her crisp white chef's coat was slightly wrinkled. She looked absolutely furious, completely exhausted, and completely heartbroken. What exactly are you doing, Harper? Sloane demanded quietly. Her voice was echoing off the metal shelves in the freezing room. I am taking the final meat inventory, Chef, I answered evenly, looking back down at my clipboard. Do not insult me, she snapped, stepping rapidly down that narrow aisle. She closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. She snatched the metal clipboard completely out of my hands and threw it onto a wire rack. The loud clatter violently shattered the heavy silence of the cooler. You have been treating me like an absolute stranger for 4 days, Sloane stated fiercely. She completely invaded my personal space. She refused to let me step away. You will look me in the eye and tell me exactly what is wrong. I forced myself to look at her. I forced myself to be cruel. Nothing is wrong, Chef, I lied smoothly. I am just focusing entirely on my work. Sloane let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Focusing on your work? She repeated incredulously. You practically flinch every single time I bide near you. The Michelin announcement is tomorrow, I reminded her coldly. We cannot afford any distractions. I am not a distraction, she fired back, her voice breaking slightly. No, I agreed softly. But I am. Sloane froze completely. Her pale gray eyes narrowed as she processed my words. Who spoke to you? She whispered dangerously. I kept my mouth completely shut. I refused to throw Marcus under the bus. It was Marcus, Sloane concluded instantly, her jaw tightening with absolute fury. He did not have to say anything, I lied again, trying to protect the sous chef. It is entirely obvious. It is obvious that you are terrified of a stupid guidebook, she challenged, stepping even closer. It is obvious that I am a line cook, I stated brutally, forcing the reality between us. You are the executive chef. If they find out about us, you lose everything. Sloane stared at me. The anger completely vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a deep, profound sadness. You think you are protecting me, she realized softly. I am protecting your empire, Sloane. I do not care about the empire, she whispered fiercely. The confession hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Do not say that, I pleaded, my voice finally cracking. You bled for this kitchen. I bled for perfection, Sloane corrected, reaching out to grab the lapels of my coat. Because I thought perfection was the only thing that could actually keep me safe. She gripped the heavy canvas fabric tightly. Her hands were freezing, but her grip was desperate. But perfection is completely empty, Harper. She looked directly into my eyes. The absolute vulnerability there completely broke my heart. This entire restaurant is a beautiful, freeze-in tune without you in it. Sloane, the 3rd star, I tried to argue weakly. I will personally burn the 3rd star to the ground if it means I get to keep you, she interrupted fiercely. She did not wait for me to reply. She pulled me down and kissed me with absolute, devastating certainty. It was a kiss that completely obliterated the entire week of forced distance. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted like absolute surrender. I dropped all of my pathetic defenses. I wrapped arms tightly around her waist. I pulled her flush against me, lifting her slightly off the freezing floor. She whimpered softly into my mouth, tangling her cold fingers deeply into my hair. We were entirely locked together in the freezing room, completely insulated from the judgment of the outside world. She finally pulled back, resting her forehead heavily against mine. Her breath plumed in white clouds between our faces. Do not ever pull away from me again, Sloane uttered breathlessly. It was not a request. It was an absolute command. I won't, I promised, brushing my thumb gently across her flushed cheek. We face the guide tomorrow, she whispered, her eyes fierce and entirely clear. Together, I agreed quietly. We unlocked the heavy metal door and walked back out into the quiet kitchen. The Michelin guide was coming tomorrow. The entire world was about to judge us. But as I watched the Ice Queen walk by, her spine perfectly straight, I completely stopped being afraid. Friday afternoon was completely agonizing. The digital clock above the central pass read exactly 2:59. The annual Michelin Guide press release was scheduled to go live at exactly 3 o'clock. The entire brigade was standing completely still on the line. Nobody was prepping, nobody was speaking. We were all just staring at the heavy frosted glass doors, waiting for Bennett to walk through them. Sloane stood at her station. Her posture was absolutely flawless. Her crisp white coat was perfect. Her face was a completely unreadable mask of cold, smooth stone. But I could see her left hand resting flat on the stainless steel counter. Her knuckles were completely white. She was pressing down so hard her fingers were trembling. At exactly 3:01, the heavy doors violently swung open. Bennett practically sprinted into the kitchen. He was holding his silver tablet completely crushed against his chest. He was breathing so heavily he could barely form a coherent word. "Well?" Sloane demanded. Her voice was terrifyingly sharp and completely steady. Bennett swallowed hard. He looked directly at the executive chef. 3 stars, Bennett choked out, a massive, disbelieving smile breaking across his face. We retained all 3, and Thorne specifically wrote the foreword. He called our menu the most brilliant evolution of the decade. For one single suspended heartbeat, the kitchen remained completely silent. Then, the entire room absolutely exploded. Marcus let out a massive roaring shout. Jason literally dropped to his knees on the tile floor. The cooks were hugging each other, slapping backs, and cheering so loudly the exhaust fans were completely drowned out. I did not cheer. I did not move. I looked straight across the chaotic celebrating room. Sloane was entirely still amidst the absolute madness. She let out one long, heavy exhale. Her rigid shoulders finally dropped a fraction of an inch. She turned her head slowly. Her pale gray eyes found mine instantly through the crowd. The ice was completely gone. Her eyes were shining brightly with absolute unrestrained joy. And something infinitely deeper. She offered me a tiny, secret smile. It was meant absolutely only for me. I smiled back, completely anchoring her in the middle of the storm. The dinner service that night was not a battle. It was an absolute victory lap. The brigade cooked with a fierce, joyful swagger. Sloane commanded the pass with a brilliant, undeniable light in her eyes. She wasn't ruling with fear tonight. She was leading with absolute inspiration. At 1 a.m, the heavy front doors finally locked. Bennett dragged 3 massive cases of vintage champagne directly into the main dining room. The entire staff gathered around the heavy oak tables. The sound of popping corks echoed loudly in the elegant space. Sloane was handed a crystal flute. She stood at the head of the room, raising her glass. "To the brigade," she announced warmly. "You executed absolute perfection." Everyone cheered loudly and drank. I stood near the back of the room, leaning quietly against the mahogany bars. I watched Marcus walk purposefully over to Sloane. He leaned in and whispered something quietly in her ear. He was looking entirely too serious for a celebration. Sloane listened to him. Her expression instantly shifted back to a serious, calculating calm. She nodded once. She put her champagne flute down on the table. She walked directly through the crowd of celebrating cooks. She walked straight toward me. Marcus followed closely behind her, his face tight with lingering anxiety. Sloane stopped exactly 1 foot in front of me. The rest of the room slowly began to quiet down, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "Harper," Sloane said clearly, ensuring the immediate circle could hear her. "Yes, Chef." "Marcus has expressed some entirely valid concerns regarding the chain of command on the meat station," she stated smoothly. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my face completely blank. "Effective immediately, you are completely removed from the meat station," Sloane announced. A heavy, confused silence fell over the surrounding cooks. Marcus looked slightly relieved, believing he had finally won. "You are no longer a line cook in my kitchen," Sloane continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority. She reached into the pocket of her crisp white coat. She pulled out a set of heavy brass keys. "You are officially promoted to head of research and development," she stated, holding the keys out to me. "You will share my private office. You will report directly to me, and only to me." Marcus's jaw practically hit the floor. It was an absolutely brilliant, flawless maneuver. She was completely elevating my status. She was removing the inappropriate power dynamic of a chef and a line cook. She was legitimizing my palate and completely protecting our professional integrity in one single strike. I stared at the heavy brass keys resting in her cold palm. I demand absolute perfection in the R&D kitchen, Harper, Sloane murmured softly. Her pale gray eyes were entirely warm, burning with a fierce, undeniable challenge. I reached out and took the keys from her hand. Our fingers brushed deliberately in front of the entire management team. I thrive in the heat, chef, I answered, a slow, confident smile breaking across my face. Sloane's lips curved upward into a breathtaking, completely unrestrained smile. She turned back to the stunned crowd and picked up a fresh glass of champagne. "Back to the celebration," she commanded smoothly. The kitchen crew immediately erupted into fresh cheers, clapping me heavily on the back. Marcus looked at me, completely defeated but entirely outplayed. He finally nodded in grudging respect and walked away. An hour later, the dining room was completely empty. The cleaning crew had finished. The lights were dimmed to a soft, romantic golden glow. I stood alone by the massive front windows, looking out at the sleeping city. I heard the soft, familiar click of her black boots on the hardwood floor. Sloane walked up behind me. She completely bypassed all professional distance. She wrapped her arms tightly around my waist from behind. She rested her chin heavily on my shoulder. "Head of R&D?" I teased softly, leaning back into her warmth. "It solves every single problem," Sloane murmured against my neck. "And it keeps you exactly where I want you." "Right next to you," I said. "Always," she promised fiercely. I turned around in her arms. I reached up and gently pulled the tight knot from her dark hair. The heady locks cascaded down her shoulders, completely softening her sharp, beautiful features. The Ice Queen was completely gone. There was only Sloane, and she was entirely mine. I pulled her forward. She met me perfectly halfway. The kiss was sweet, deep, and completely devoid of any remaining fear. We had successfully navigated the absolute worst of the fire, and the victory tasted completely flawless.
Ultimately, Sloane and Harper remind us that true brilliance isn't about maintaining icy, flawless control. It's about having the courage to step out of your fortress and surrender to the fire, together. If this slow-burn, Michelin-starred romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please give this video a massive thumbs up. Your support means the world to Taylor's secret library and helps us bring you more breathtaking GL stories. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. I have to know, which moment made your heart race more today? Was it the dangerous midnight knife-sharpening showdown, or that desperate, freezing kiss in the walk-in cooler? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your heart open, stay passionate, and I'll see you in the next chapter.